Of the 195 nations that constitute today's world, none comes close to the sheer scale of Russia. Stretching more than 600 miles from the small enclave of Kaliningrad in the west to Big Diomede Island in the east, Russia spans 11 time zones and covers a total of 6,074 square miles. Its scale is so staggering that the second largest nation on Earth, Canada, could fit within its borders more than 1.7 times. For well over 3 centuries, Russia in one form or another has held its place as the world's largest country, and at the peak of its territorial reach in 1866, it extended all the way from Poland to Alaska. Yet just a few centuries prior, a recognizable Russian state did not exist at all. From amongst a patchwork of warring principalities and yurts that characterized the region, the earliest traces of a nation began to take shape, one that, through the ambitions and endeavors of Tsars and Cossacks alike, would eventually rise to become the largest country on Earth. This is the story of how Russia became the world's biggest nation. To properly understand the emergence of the Russian state and its expansion, it is most useful to focus on the geographical region of European Russia, the smaller western section of the country lying west of the Ural Mountains. Much of this area is shaped by the Volga River and its tributaries, and it is here that the country's major cities, including Moscow, Kazan, Samara, Volgograd, and Astrakhan, are situated. A fully established nation-state would not take shape here until medieval times, but the vast plains of the Pontic, Caspian steppe had been home to a succession of different Indo-European and Germanic tribes over the centuries. These included the Scythians during ancient Greek times, followed by groups such as the Sarmatians, the Huns, and the Goths, peoples who would go on to threaten and ultimately help bring down the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 5th centuries AD. The region began to acquire some degree of territorial cohesion and cultural identity in the 9th and 10th centuries, largely owing to the southward expansion of the Norse out of Scandinavia. Although the Vikings are more commonly associated with their raids on Britain and Western Europe, they were considerably more active in Eastern Europe during this period. Having crossed the Baltic Sea and navigated the great rivers of the Volga, Don, and Dnieper, they penetrated the Black and Caspian Seas and launched raids against both the Byzantine Empire and Arab caliphates. Over time, these itinerant Norsemen began settling more permanently along the riverbanks they traveled, laying the foundations of cities such as Kiev, Novgorod, and Staraya Ladoga, which they governed as small independent city-states. The Norse rulers of these settlements, known as the Rus, gradually assimilated with the local Slavic population and subsequently extended their territories, forming the first large-scale states in the region. Among them the Kievan Rus state of the late 9th century and later the Novgorod Republic of the 12th century. By the 13th century, the republics and principalities that had grown up along the rivers and lakes of western Russia, Novgorod, Pskov, and the Duchy of Moscow among them, had become prosperous through trade and commerce. Novgorod in particular benefited from strong commercial ties with the Hanseatic League of merchant cities across the Baltic and North Seas. By the year 1223, however, a formidable threat had emerged from the east, the Mongols. These nomadic horsemen from Asia had swept westward across the Eurasian steppe, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, conquering every settlement in their path. They defeated a coalition of Rus principalities at the Battle of the Kalka River, but then pulled their forces back eastward, only to return 14 years later, subjugating nearly all of the southern Rus lands, razing cities such as Kiev to the ground in 1240 and incorporating their territories into the Golden Horde. The majority of the northern Rus principalities avoided outright destruction by submitting to the Mongols, whose grip over Western Russia would endure for the next 2 centuries. Several khanates established along the lower reaches of the Volga and Don rivers. The Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate, and the Khanate of Kazan wielded enormous power and influence across the region, extracting heavy tributes from the northern Rus cities and territories such as Moscow and Novgorod that were not formally under their direct control. The Mongol Khanates across Asia were in decline by the opening of the 15th century, as new powers such as the Ottomans in the Middle East and the Ming dynasty in China rose to prominence. In Russia, the ascending force was the Duchy of Moscow, which during the reign of Ivan III, between 1462 and 1505, launched a series of campaigns against the Khanate of Kazan to wrest control of the upper reaches of the Volga. Ivan III also conquered Novgorod along with the Republic of Pskov and the Principality of Tver, absorbing them all into his domain. Thus, by the dawn of the 16th century, a centralized Russian state of sorts had emerged, stretching from Lake Ladoga in the north southward along the Volga River. These territorial gains were extended further by his grandson, Ivan IV, better known to history as Ivan the Terrible, who pushed Russian authority southward toward the Caspian Sea. In 1547, Ivan IV had himself crowned as the first Tsar of all Russia, setting in motion a sequence of events that would initiate Russia's eastward expansion across the Ural Mountains in the centuries to come. This endeavor was initially undertaken by small bands of Cossacks from the steppe, a semi-nomadic people highly regarded for their abilities as horseback fighters. Commissioned by Russian authorities to probe further eastward, and under the command of figures such as Yermak Timofeyevich, the Cossacks successfully conquered the Siberian Khanate in what is now Kazakhstan. Their unchecked ambitions would swiftly set off a chain of further exploratory expeditions deeper into the vast expanse of Siberia. Within 100 years, Russian explorers had reached the Kamchatka Peninsula on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. And throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, small colonies began to take root across the region. Efforts were also made to push Russian territory across the Pacific Ocean itself, with Vitus Bering, a Danish captain and cartographer in the service of the Russian Navy, being commissioned in 1733 to chart the sea and straits that would subsequently bear his name in recognition of his achievements. Although the expedition ultimately cost Bering his life, the discovery of the islands and adjacent coastline of Alaska in 1741 drew further exploration by fur trappers and adventurers, eventually resulting in Russia formally claiming those lands. Despite the remarkable accomplishments of eastward expansion during this era, Russia's primary ambition in the 17th century was to forge closer ties with continental Europe through westward expansion, and, crucially, to secure access to a warm water port on the Baltic Sea. At the time, Finland and much of the region around what is now the northwestern extremity of Russia were under Swedish control, as were portions of the Baltic states. Russia was consequently dependent on the port of Arkhangelsk in the far north for the bulk of its European trade, but its location within the Arctic Circle severely limited its usefulness due to freezing conditions in winter. In response, Russia embarked on a prolonged war against Sweden to acquire new lands along the Baltic and secure the warm water port it so urgently needed. The Great Northern War, fought from 1700 to 1721, saw Tsar Peter, known to posterity as Peter the Great, defeat the Swedes, and in doing so claim sovereignty over the territories bordering the Gulf of Finland, as well as what is now modern-day Estonia and Latvia. With victory secured, Peter the Great set about constructing a magnificent new capital city on the shores of the Baltic, one which he modestly named after himself, St. Petersburg. His reign was also highly consequential in other respects, As he undertook an extensive tour of Western Europe from 1697 to 1698 to observe the scientific and technological advances taking place there. Upon his return, he drew on what he had witnessed and began modernizing Russia, transforming it into one of the continent's foremost powers. By the time his reign concluded in 1725, Russia had emerged as a major international force after long years of backwardness and poverty. The expansionist legacy of Peter was built upon later in the 18th century by Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796 and was determined to extend Russian influence southward around the Black Sea. War was declared against the Ottoman Empire in 1768, and by 1774 Russia had seized the cities of Azov and Kerch. From this secure foundation, Russia continued to incrementally push its southern borders at the Ottoman Empire's expense over the following decades, marching forces into the Caucasus, the northeastern Balkans, and the Crimean Peninsula. Further territories were also acquired during Catherine's reign through the partitions of Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had declined sharply as a power over the course of the 18th century, and by the 1770s its three powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, were well positioned to carve it up among themselves. Across three partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795 Russia acquired vast territories encompassing most of Ukraine, virtually all of Belarus and Lithuania, and a portion of eastern Poland. This firmly cemented Russia's standing as one of the most formidable states on the continent, owing above all to its immense size and the vast population it could draw upon for its defense. This display of military and imperial might was demonstrated vividly during the Napoleonic Wars, when Russia stood alone among the continental powers in successfully resisting the advance of the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Despite suffering a French invasion in 1812, Russia managed to repel it, chiefly through the vastness of its territory and the brutal severity of its winters, which devastated the ranks of the invading French army. By the time the conflict concluded in 1815, Russia had also gained control of portions of what is now Poland, as well as Finland, which Tsar Alexander I governed semi-independently as Grand Duke. Separate conflicts in the early 19th century against the Ottomans around the Black Sea and against Persian and native Caucasian forces brought further Russian gains in those regions. Russia would reach the zenith of its power during the 19th century, a period that inspired genuine alarm among Europe's other great powers, Britain in particular, who feared that Russia's continued expansion would threaten their colonial interests on the global stage. In the Far East, Russia secured territorial concessions from China in 1861, leading to the founding of Vladivostok, the country's only ice-free port on the Pacific coast. This acquisition grew increasingly important in the years that followed, for in 1867 Russia opted to sell its imperial land holdings in North America, namely Alaska, to the United States for the then relatively modest sum of $7.2 million, equivalent to approximately $151 million today. To compensate for the loss of Alaska, Russia turned its attention further into Central Asia, though this strategic shift inevitably alarmed the British, who viewed it as an encroachment upon their sphere of influence over British India and Pakistan. The intense diplomatic and military rivalry that emerged from this standoff came to be known as the Great Game, in which both Britain and Russia vied for control and influence over Afghanistan and Persia, the two buffer states separating their respective empires. In both cases, Russia's ambitions were ultimately frustrated, though it did manage to secure dominion over the Khanate of Kuva and the Emirates of Bukhara across what is now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Neither Britain nor Russia ever succeeded in securing direct control over Afghanistan, despite repeated military campaigns over the decades. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the dramatic decline of the Ottoman Empire presented Russia with yet another opportunity for territorial gain during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. Though the Russian advance was halted before it could reach Constantinople, Russia's proximity to the city and the prospect of seizing it, along with access to the Mediterranean, posed a genuine threat to the other European powers. They subsequently convened at the Congress of Berlin in 1878 to check any further Russian ambitions in the Balkans and ensure that out of the disintegrating Ottoman Empire would emerge new independent states, such as Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia, free from direct Russian domination. For all that Russia had amassed in terms of territory between the 17th and 19th centuries, it nonetheless remained a backward country with a weak economy, particularly in comparison with its Western contemporaries. The authoritarian political system of Tsarist Russia had also created a deeply volatile atmosphere by the latter half of the 19th century, with increasingly radical movements such as anarchism and communism gaining ground among the populace. It was during Russia's disastrous involvement in the First World War that the communists seized their moment to launch a revolution in 1917. By year's end, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, the communists, also known as the Bolsheviks or the Reds, had taken control of St. Petersburg and Moscow. A bitter civil war quickly followed, pitting them against the more moderate factions of Russia's revolutionary movement, known as the Whites. When the conflict finally ended in 1923, the result was the emergence of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, in which the communists had managed to retain control over the vast majority of the former Russian Empire. Though Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states had seized the opportunity to declare independence and re-establish themselves as sovereign nations, the very survival of the USSR would soon be called into question with the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. The 6-year conflict proved catastrophically costly for the Soviets, but as German forces began to retreat across the Eastern Front in 1943, the Soviets advanced in their wake across Eastern Europe. In the war's aftermath, the USSR effectively absorbed the entire region, with the Baltic states being incorporated directly as Soviet republics while communist satellite states were established across Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Although the post-war years brought no further territorial expansion for Soviet Russia, the escalating Cold War with the United States saw Russian influence projected across the globe through its support of communist regimes in countries such as North Korea, North Vietnam, Cuba, Afghanistan, and many others. Nevertheless, despite the communist propaganda painting Soviet Russia as a thriving socialist republic, by the 1970s and 1980s the USSR had fallen considerably behind the United States and other Western powers, having failed to innovate technologically or develop its economy. Despite the efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev, as General Secretary of the Communist Party, to reform the Soviet Union, the damage was by then largely irreversible. In the years that followed, the entire edifice of communism began to unravel, as the countries of the Eastern Bloc first broke away from Moscow amid growing calls for the dissolution of the USSR. This delay came to pass through the events of 1990 and 1991, with the USSR being formally dissolved to give way to the independent nations of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and finally, the modern-day Russian Federation.